We will now begin the last session. The last session is the South Korean educational ODA's next steps for educational recovery. The moderator of this session is Professor Jongwon, who is a professor of public administration at Yonsei University and who is also an associate dean at the Graduate School of Public University of the same university and the assistant professor of East Asian languages and cultures of Indiana University.
네, 안녕하세요. 연세대학교 행정학과 정원주 교수입니다.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Professor Jongwon from Public Administration Division of Yonsei University, and Session D will be proceeded on the theme of South Korean educational ODA's next steps for educational recovery, particularly the policy, the direction of South Korea in the post-COVID-19 era. I'd like to invite the first speaker of Session D, Professor Hwanbo of Chungnam National University. He will deliver a presentation.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As introduced, I'm Hwanbo Park, Associate Professor of the Education Department of Chungnam National University. I would like to talk about the changes and challenges in Korea's education, ODA, and in doing so, I would like to think about the future of education ODA. So the topic I am going to cover is quite broad, so I want to take a look back at educational ODA in Korea in the past and the present, and also think about, in that sense, what we can expect in the future. Since the late 1990s, ODA, Korea began to provide ODA, and education ODA began in 2004. And the direction at the time was to export Korea's educational service. So it was about how we can export Korea's educational service, how we can share Korea's experience in the education sector. The direction was a focus on the economy and enhancing the wealth or health of the developing countries. So in some sense, it was in line with the interest of the developing countries, but in another sense, it was not. After Korea joined OECD, ODA started to increase exponentially, and there was heightened interest in Korea's education. And as was mentioned by many presenters, I'm sure, financial resources in the education sector also increased. And so at this juncture, there was a transition in the direction of educational ODA. People start to think about how we can contribute to education in the global community. And then 2015, after the SDGs were adopted, or actually before, in May of that year, Korea was greatly involved in setting up the goals for the education in SDG. So we needed to move on from just simply exporting Korea's educational experience and services. There was a need to discuss the issue as a global agenda. So instead of unilateral assistance to developing countries, the focus was that we needed to work with our developing country partners together in providing educational ODA. And in experiencing COVID-19, I think it became very clear that we need to stick together. And of course, these non-face-to-face meetings was not an option but a necessity. But through this experience, we were reminded of the importance of communication. So let's take a look at what the place that education secured in MDGs. So some EFAs were actually embedded into the Millennium Development Goals. And at the time, the consideration was made that if education was not embedded in the international development agenda in order to secure finance for education. But as you can see, not all the goals of EFA was embedded into MDGs. And in SDGs, as you know, it was very important to have a separate independent goal for education. And within SDGs, education has a standalone goal, but because of this, the interconnectedness with other goals was weakened. The goal of education in itself is important, but education is also a foundation for growth in other sectors. And of course, we highlight this all the time, but at the same time, carving out an independent sector within these global agendas and sustainable goals is very important. So basically, the initiative or the leadership that education needs to take as a goal has been what was considered so far. So there is a legal framework for ODA. Korea provides ODA based on the Framework Act on International Development Cooperation. And of course, educational ODA is also governed by national strategies related to ODA. As mentioned by the previous presenter, the focus is this in setting educational ODA goals. And so you can see that recently the strategic objectives have all been linked to different SDG goals and targets. As I mentioned earlier, educational ODA has continued to rise over the years, and the educational sector has always secured a certain percentage of total ODA. This means that Korea places and increasingly places great importance on educational ODA. If you look at the projects by the Education Ministry, you can see that the largest share is taken up by scholarships and aside from fostering talent, you can see that the projects are not that many. Education Ministry, however, still pursues a lot of projects, and so quantitatively and qualitatively speaking, the educational ODA in Korea has continued to expand. And in this process, there are many challenges that we need to consider. First is the purpose of education ODA going forward. As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, the beginning of educational ODA in Korea was to export educational services and experiences. And will we continue down this path, or will we complement it with other goals and purposes? And I think we are at a juncture where we need to consider this. We need to contribute to the global community, but we need to look beyond the COVID pandemic and now and think about how we are going to contribute to the future. Once we establish the purpose, then we will have to think about the governance. Governance is about bringing in expert agencies and expert organizations, but at the same time, building a more comprehensive governance that allows for many different actors. If you think about the challenges in education ODA, in the past, a lot of the ODA projects pertain to providing hardware. So there were a lot of limitations, and there came a point when we stopped hardware. But I think that just because we faced difficulties, that doesn't mean that we have to stop the relevant project. As you can see, there are still many regions and countries that still need the hardware and that still need the infrastructure. However, because these projects the projects failed because these hardware were not integrated into the software or the curriculum of the recipient countries. And another challenge relates to the feature of educational ODA. I'm sure that everybody agrees that when it comes to education, the outcomes or the results come out after quite a long period of time. So you need to have a very long-term view. But given the features of projects, the short-term immediate results are oftentimes demanded. So most successful education ODA projects are long-term supported projects. For instance, teacher training programs. The successful programs are very long-term, 5 to 7 years, and they are based on trust. And so we need to move away from demanding very visible and tangible results early on in the project. Also, we need to reflect the needs of partner countries. And many times, we do not know well about the recipient countries. Not enough homework has been done. Here in this picture, you can see a boy in a Rwandan school. And this is a rural area in Rwanda. And the boy is receiving coding education. And I'm sure that this is very unfamiliar because many people believe that all the children are starving in Rwanda. But we need to take a look at our recipient countries with fresh eyes. Also, there's greater demand for Korean education and education on Korea. And we need to think about how much we can provide this and foster cooperation along the way. And we also need to bridge the education ODA and the national education. There is not a strong link between national education and education ODA. The education ODA is considered a project, and then you have a separate project for the field, and you have a separate project for education in Korea. So there are a few cases where teacher and students engaged in exchange programs, and some of these programs are related to global citizenship education, and this is linked with ICT. For instance, we had students come together in classes regarding global citizenship education. So these are some of the case examples that we can think about. And if you look at the educational ODA overseas, there are many different contents and many different modalities. Good Neighbors International Project is what you can see on the slide. The CSO and the government and companies and the private sector all came together to put together this project, and the outcome was also very diverse. This was a project carried out by Educators Without Borders. So what they did was they integrated literacy education with health education. And these are some case examples that we need to consider. Instead of thinking about one subject or one topic of educational ODA, we can integrate different elements. And also in Southeast Asia, many countries are building a blended learning platform. And we need to look back on how much we understand this. Like, for instance, for countries that already have this platform, what kind of contributions can we make? What kind of contents can we provide? So, in short, educational ODA for educational recovery is as follows. So we need to respond to the need for digital education. What kind of cooperation can we engage in? For instance, we need a more holistic sort of approach, and we also respond to the need for health education. We need to collaborate in this sector. We need to foster experts, and we also need to provide more health education in the primary and secondary levels as well. And we also need to provide support for safety education as well. And we also need to provide continued support for continuous learning. Of course, this is a challenge both at home and abroad. How are we going to deal with school disruptions? As I said, this is an issue that is faced both face and abroad, and so we can collaborate internationally to come up with solutions. And lastly, we need to discuss the new vision of future education. The goal of future education is to live together in prosperity, and in that sense, we would have to provide a peace education or global citizenship education. In other words, we need to set a direction and then think about how we are going to implement that and achieve that. And so in order to do that, we also need to change the methodology. Basically, as I mentioned earlier, instead of focusing on short-term tangible results, we need more long-term projects. And the domestic education offices and the education sector's activities can be linked with educational ODA projects. And in order to do that, we need the participation of government, the private sector, and academia. So we need a broader network of educational ODA. And we also need to foster the expertise that exists in developing countries. There are many agencies in the recipient countries and experts in the recipient countries, and we need to think about how we can utilize them and take advantage of them. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Park. Professor Park talked about the status and history of educational ODA, and he also talked about the challenges posed by COVID-19, and he also talked about the opportunities that it presents. And lastly, he also gave us some proposals about the way forward.
Our next speaker is the Director Hai-Jeong of Office of Global Education Cooperation Research of KEDI, and she also is a private expert of Council of Institutions Research Grant Aid and expert member of Education Sector of KOICA. Could you please go ahead with your presentation, Director An? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Hai-Jeong, Director of Office of Global Education Cooperation Research of KEDI. Today, I'd like to talk about the education issues faced by developing countries in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the direction of educational sector cooperation as a part of ODA. First of all, I'd like to talk about the educational issues faced by developing countries in the COVID-19 pandemic era. The first issue is learning loss. It seems that around 90% of students experience stopping or the interruption in their learning due to school closures worldwide, and more serious learning losses in developing countries are identified due to school closures. And also, it will be difficult to return to education even after the COVID-19 pandemic is over for those in the developing countries. And the next issue is education inequality. Decreased academic achievement is happening due to the absence of school education, and also the education bipolarization is deepened. And also increased in education equality happens by prolonged education losses of vulnerable children and adolescents. And the third issue is the well-being threats in terms of the learner's well-being. Increased the frequency of experiencing domestic violence is reported, and increased the depression, sense of isolation, and emotional anxiety is being identified. And due to the school meal discontinuation, actually malnutrition is happening in developing country. And the next issue is remote learning related issue. That there is a growing need for various types of remote learning due to the prolonged school closures. However, in developing countries, there is low opportunity of remote learning because poor internet connections and infrastructure, and there is a growing need of context-appropriate types, device, and the contents of remote learning. Now, I'd like to talk about the changes of development cooperation projects in education sector. SKEDI research on SDG 4, which I led with my team members. And I would like to talk about the KEDI research, which is related to Sustainable Development Goal number 4, and the research title is Research on Education Development Cooperation to Achieve SDGs, Investigating Action Strategies. And the objective of the research is to investigate the action strategies of education development cooperation for achieving SDG 4 in developing countries. Actually, it is taking care of 6 years and 7 sub-targets to come up with the relevant action plans. So if you take a look at the 4th year, the outcome of the research in the fields of education quality, the equal education access for vulnerable people was surveyed, and also we interviewed the working level of people, particularly the project managers and the practitioners from 18 Korean CSOs. And as for this year, 2021 interview, we interviewed 15 project managers and the practitioners from 10 Korean CSOs. And please refer to the research full paper, which is posted on the KEDI website for more details. And the changes made in terms of the development cooperation projects in education sector, the first change we can identify is the expansion of remote activities. However, there are certain difficulties because of the difficulties in business trips to developing countries, and that is why we are conducting remote implementation of the project or programs. And the second change is that there is a decline in educational development cooperation project because of school closures. And even if schools are not closed, there are changes required in terms of the educational development cooperation project because of the COVID-19 situation. And we all know that educational development cooperation involves personal exchanges, and the COVID-19 pandemic situation prohibits such kind of personal exchanges. Let me quote one of the answers given by our respondents. The education project received the hardest hit now because all schools were closed, and even if it's not fully closed, or even if the activity is not necessarily happening in school, other projects are now running, but gathering and training are not allowed. There are areas where people have to depend on food rations to live. So this time, as a COVID-19 support project, we are going to distribute something like the emergency package, and also the on-site or the site-oriented system should be established for efficient or effective implementation of the cooperation project. From now on, I'd like to talk about the directions of ODA for educational recovery. Actually, there is no change in our basic direction toward the implementation or the completion of SDG by 2030. In order to achieve that goal, we need to improve our education support for vulnerable people. We need to expand the quality education opportunities for vulnerable groups in consideration of their environment and context. And we also need to strengthen our cooperation with the CSOs to achieve such goal. And we also need to provide support the design of formal and non-formal education, the programs of the partner countries. But we all know that in most developing countries, it's extremely hard for us to collect the information or data with regard to the educational impact of each different vulnerable group. And the next agenda ahead of us is to support the remote education. We need to investigate infrastructure for remote learning in local communities, and also we can come up with the remote education service that can be immediately applied, such as the remote education through radio. And also we need to support the capacity building of remote education using ICT devices as well as infrastructure for remote education. And next, we need to build the capacity of local manpower. In order to enable remote measurement and evaluation of a cooperation project, we need to increase the manpower or the capabilities of local people. And also, we need to develop a training programs in various methods and contents for local teachers and officers. Next, we need to diversify a development cooperation. We need to enhance our partnerships with international organizations and NGOs. Furthermore, we need to expand the participation of private companies in education development cooperation. Next, we need to strengthen our partnership with the CSOs, because the CSOs have better access to the vulnerable groups. So by enhancing our partnership with CSO, we can have a better means to provide better support to the vulnerable groups. And also, if the participation of the private sector players increases, then actually we can increase the budget. And that's why we need to diversify the participation of different actors in development cooperation. Last but not least, we need to develop a new ODA model. We need to develop an innovative model linking other foreign and domestic policies. And also we can develop the model by restructuring existing ODA projects. Last but not least, we can we need to create a tripartite cooperation model to provide support in connection with the key countries and organizations in the region. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you, Director Ahn. Director Ahn briefed us on a multi-year research project conducted by KEDI and also gave a very valuable information about what's going on site in developing countries. She also emphasized the importance of multilateral partnership to further promote effectiveness of the cooperation education cooperation projects.
Now let me invite the last presenter, Jongwon, who will be delivering a presentation on harnessing ICT for education development. Mr. Jongwon is the Director of the Office of Strategy Planning, Korea Education and Research Information Service. I think I will stay in line with the topic that has been covered so far. The global pandemic has brought about a lot of confusion in the educational ODA sector. Before COVID, developing countries were faced with many issues regarding technology and ICT, but we felt that we would be able to resolve them. But confusion continues. In the past 20 and 30 years, international community has been making a lot of efforts. And the theme of this session is the next steps for Korea's educational ODA. And I would like to talk about what we should focus on when it comes to employing ICT in our educational ODA. 30 years ago, in a small city in Thailand, the Jomtien Declaration was announced, and it was turned into the Dakar Framework for Action in 2000. And during this process, ICT took a center stage. It was seen as a way to expand opportunities for education and also the quality of education. And many of the reports published at the time mentioned this, and it was seen as a way to overcome the digital divide and digital gap. In 2015, the Incheon Declaration was announced, and the Qingdao Declaration was also announced, and specific targets and goals related to ICT was derived. ICT is a strategy and mechanism for lifelong learning. In particular, it received a lot of spotlight in non-formal education. So open courses such as MOOC was seen as a possibility to enhance the potential of developing countries. It was also linked to the human rights of women and the right to education for women. So it was seen as a way to provide inclusive education, and in particular, mobile education received a lot of attention. In order to apply the ICT to schools, the competency of teachers are important, and this fact started to be highlighted in 2015. And ICT training for pre-service and in-service teachers was highlighted at this point. And UNESCO led the discourse on ICT in education. And it came up with enhancing 21st century competencies, and it also talked about the pedagogical innovation that would be needed. And at the center of this is teacher competency, and therefore teacher capacity building and distance learning was highlighted. But looking back, there are some points we need to reconsider. If you look at the UNESCO report published this year, this is what it says. 100 million more children failed basic reading skills due to COVID-19, and the pandemic has disrupted schooling for an average of 25 weeks. And 65% of low-income countries have reduced educational funding. And this is leading to a generational catastrophe. So this is leading to trauma of an entire generation. Furthermore, if you look at a report published by the World Bank this year, the report states that 90% of 10-year-olds in remote classes cannot read. So vulnerable children cannot read, and distance education system was not properly provided in most countries. And even in European countries, there are not many cases where real-time interactive classes were provided. Google Meet, Microsoft Teams, Zooms. These commercial platforms were used in some countries, but their use was limited. And as a result, since last year, we need to take stock of Pakistan's telescope project or Sierra Leone's radio-based project. And if you look at these cases, they remind us of the analog-based remote learning that was mentioned 30 years ago, and this could raise some concerns. And in this process, in the pandemic, amid the pandemic, there are some policies and measures that we should take notice of. A lot of people are sick of Zoom. I also attend a lot of Zoom meetings, and I find it excruciating, actually, to take part in these Zoom meetings. In India, using appropriate technology, have come up with a game-based learning program. It's kind of like Minecraft, but it's a farm craft. So students learn how to grow crop in cyberspace. And this program, MindSpark, has been very successful. And although it is not directly related to ICT, the UK government has come up with a new initiative, the Turing Scheme initiative. This initiative was born out of a concern of the UK government that their students will lose competency after Brexit. In Europe, all students can take advantage of Erasmus system. And so UK students will not be able to take advantage of the Erasmus system, and that is why they came up with this Turing scheme, and this is something that is noteworthy. When we think about ICT in education, we think about the ICT as a delivery mechanism, but recently ICT itself is considered a subject to be learned. In November last year, the Korean government also announced the general discussion for the curriculum revision, and it aims to deal with digital literacy and media literacy. So in the past, Korea focused on software and coding education, but now that has changed, and the Korean government is focusing on artificial intelligence. And in developing countries, there is a demand to foster talent in these new sectors. And I believe that this is where we can find a great potential for future educational ODA. With our partner countries, we will be able to grow together. So fostering talent in Korea is important, but also collaborating with recipient countries could prove to be an opportunity. And as I mentioned earlier, UNESCO and the World Bank place great importance on OER, open education resources. Because this is a free educational content, we need to think about how we can localize this and how we can form a repository in which Korean students can take advantage of and recipient country students can take advantage of as well. I have a few cases from some developed countries. In Germany, they came up with a smart learning application, LMS. And recently, they have combined video gaming and learning, and they have come up with a Twitch-like platform, which is an online gamification platform. And they have also come up with a new social learning platform. And through these social learning platforms, we are providing in Korea a method to learn different social skills. And recently, we have seen the emergence of Open STEM Labs programs. Technology is no longer seen simply as an educational delivery mechanism. Rather, this takes advantage of VR and metaverse, very popular concepts. And science labs, contextual labs are built in virtual reality. And this means that without the physical infrastructure, developing countries can take advantage of these so-called facilities. The last example is the European School Net. This is an Education Minister Council of Europe, if you will. They have a project called e-twinning, and this was started 15 years ago. So a school in rural Finland and a school in another country can meet monthly on the cyber platform and or even weekly. And this promotes cultural understanding and learning of different countries and cultures. And Korea has had similar programs as well. The city of Busan and a city in Australia have also engaged in a similar project to enhance understanding of each other's countries and cultures to enhance global citizenry. Now, because I do not have a lot of time, I'm going to highlight some of the educational ODA policy efforts that have been made, especially in the ICT sector by the Korean government. We have different bilateral programs carried out by KOICA, and recently through EDCF, we are providing support for recipient countries to make policy decisions using EMIS system. CARIS also is pursuing different international cooperation initiatives. The different initiatives makes use of learning platforms and learning management systems and other R&D systems. And we are providing these systems and initiatives to the recipient countries. Next year, we will carry out a project with Colombia, and the Colombia government asked that we come up with a way to support them to build a policy roadmap to foster ICT talent in their country. So as you can see, the scope of the projects are very broad. I would now like to go over simply the major achievements of these projects. First of all, these efforts have improved learning environments in developing countries in integrating digital technology. And schools were transformed as the heart of the community. Many developing countries, the parents do not want children to go to school. They would rather their children engage in economic activity. However, with the school being more interesting and the school teaching children how to use digital tools, students feel that school is more fun and interesting. In a previous session, we talked. There was a question about the efficacy of digital learning. From my personal experience, I would like to say that we cannot determine this from a cognitive perspective. I do not think that that is very meaningful. What is more meaningful is to look at the affective domain. When this technology is used, schools can change, and the perception of schools by the children can change, and the children can think of their children differently. They can think of their friends differently, and this can perhaps motivate them differently. And it can also impact their perception regarding the world. And this is something that we need to continue to look into. Lastly, I would like to make some policy recommendations. In developing countries, for organic growth, we need more long-term or mid to long-term projects, and this was echoed by some of my fellow speakers. Currently, agencies, institutions really have a lot of demand for institutional development, as mentioned in the previous session. For instance, nursing schools need a program or way to foster more nurses, or a developing country would like to foster more teachers. So instead of receiving a program or hardware, they want to support in establishing their own system and policy roadmap to achieve that goal. And as I mentioned earlier, developing countries have a demand to foster talent in the so-called new industries, and I think Korea has a lot of competitiveness in the private and academia and also in industry. For instance, I think that we can provide educational ODA and collaboration based on our strength. And as I mentioned earlier, through virtual reality, we can build a science laboratory apps, and we can also provide and distribute more contents through open educational resources, or OER. And in terms of policy, Korea provides a lot of funds to international agencies, and I think that universities and other agencies can take part in projects that can utilize these funds. And personally, what I believe is very meaningful is we need to foster experts at home that can become experts in educational ODA. So we can train and induce the participation of university students who are interested. And we can give them opportunities to take part in real projects. If you look back in the past 4 years, one of the biggest achievements is that many of the university students who got this experience moved on to international agencies or other NGOs or other civic organizations. They actually got employed. And so at the end of the day, their participation or them moving on to becoming experts will actually build a stronger ecosystem. And many youth in the U.S. actually have built startups that provide educational ODA. And I think that we need more support for youth who are interested in educational ODA. So in order to deal with and prepare for COVID-19, of course, we will all need to collaborate. But as I mentioned earlier, our institutions, our universities, and the private sector and the civic center must come together to build a stronger foundation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Seo. He talked about ICT and educational ODA, and he talked about how ICT can be an enabler for educational ODA, and he gave us a lot of cases, and he talked about what lessons we need to learn from each of these cases. Thank you for your presentation.
Now let us have a Q&A session. A few days ago, I visited UN website, and there was a report saying that the COVID-19 actually wiped out the 20 years of educational gains that the international community has gained. So for the past 20 years, we have made various efforts in the sector of education, but now we are going back to the place where we were like 20 years ago. So actually, we need to go back to the day when we actually launched the Millennium Development Goals like 20 years ago. So it's a serious situation. And also, we think about how we can improve resilience and the resilience-related education. And it seems there are a lot of people who take interest in such topics. We have questions from the participants. Please listen to the questions and think about your answers. We have a question from Kim Sun-mi, and her question is directed to Professor Park. As a part of our cooperation to reduce the digital education gap, what kind of things can be done in the form of ODA? And the second question is asked by a participant called Jin Eun-young, and her question is directed to Director Seo. So what could be the specific targets and areas and implementation methodology with regard to the ICT ODA education? And there is another question asked by a participant, Yang Chang-yeol, and his question is directed to both Professor Park and Director Seo. So I know that neither of you are from the Ministry of Education, but his question is, what would be the key role of a Ministry of Education in education ODA? Is it necessary to arrange a meeting among the participants of ODA education product? And another question is directed to Director Yang. Actually, as a COICA director, you have engaged yourself in various ODA projects in developing countries. And in your conclusion, you just mentioned the importance of a partnership with private sector actors. So actually, we need to work with CSOs and NGOs and international organizations to have a better impact or outcome of the ODA project. We all know that a partnership can bring about great results and outcomes. So the partnership should be the ultimate goal, not only the means of our project implementation. But it's very difficult to maintain partnership, particularly in developing countries. Once the project is over, then actually it's very difficult to maintain or have a continued impact of the project in developing countries. So in terms of partnership, what would be the ways to further strengthen and maintain partnership in the field of education ODA. Professor Park, could you please answer first?
Thank you very much. I think I received two questions. The first question was, what can ODA do to reduce the digital education gap? I think that Mr. Seo is an expert and he is more qualified to answer that question. But what I can say is that I think that we can improve the educational infrastructure. I think that this is an urgent project. I think that this is what ODA can deal with. But I think that aside from infrastructure, there are many other elements to be considered. First, it pertains to digital literacy, as mentioned by Mr. Seo, and he actually emphasized this. When we talk about the digital divide, we're not simply talking about the digital infrastructure divide. We also need to resolve the gap in digital literacy. So there would be many opportunities for co-opportunities in that area. And we could also cooperate to utilize ICT to enhance digital accessibility. In Korea, we are also grappling with what we can do after building infrastructure and after providing contents in terms of educational delivery. So the way you deliver a course using ICT is different, perhaps with the analog way. So this is something that we need to contemplate as well. So in the past, we're used to going to a class and listening to a lecture for 40 to 50 minutes. But in digital education, we have to think about whether 40 to 50 minutes is the same 40 to 50 minutes online. So no country has actually experienced this. So I think that educational ODA can play a part in facilitating this sort of cooperation. And to answer your second question, I think the education ministry is in the best position to integrate the different resources. So even if we have an ODA agency, their experience and their network will be different from that of the education ministry. As I mentioned earlier, the education ministry can accumulate the resources in Korea and facilitate the utilization of these resources. And the education can become a platform for communication for different actors that can play a part in educational ODA. Mr. Seo, with regards to ICT ODA projects, I think there are several that I would like to introduce. First, this project is now complete, as I understand. We had a project, the Solar School project, which was carried out in 12 African countries. So what happened there was we transformed containers into science labs or digital labs. So the Solar Schools was funded by Samsung Electronics, and the Korean Education Ministry and CARIS provided training to enhance the capacity of teachers, and we also provided contents that can be used in the Solar Classroom. And the second project, which I'm especially proud of, it was carried out in Uzbekistan. We carried out e-learning consulting project, and Uzbekistan wanted to draw up a policy roadmap, and we assisted in this. And what they wanted was enhancing the teacher capacity in ICT, and they wanted to develop a module, and this brought together international agencies and Korean partners. So there was a bilateral cooperation. But the beginning of this project was the education minister. The UNESCO Bangkok office carried out a basic research on basic competencies of teachers with Korean funding, but this report was not localized in the Uzbekistan context. And so the Uzbekistan government made a request. So we carried out a project in which we carried out a teacher training module and also a policy roadmap for Uzbekistan, which is applied nationwide. And we also fostered leading teachers in software education in 2019 in Paraguay, and also we carried out this project in Vietnam as well. And I would like to answer the second question as well. I completely agree with Professor Bach. I think the Education Ministry has the power to bring together people and utilize its network. Also, it has to recognize that there's a lot of enthusiasm on the part of teachers to take part in educational ODA. Once they build their experience and once they get knowledge, teachers can relay this to children. And so I think that this is where the power of the Education Ministry lies. And in the Leading Universities project and other globalization projects, there are many achievements and outcomes that are coming out. And the Education Minister will be in the best position to handle and manage these outcomes.
Director On? Yes, you asked a question about partnership. Basically, when it comes to the education sector and the Ministry of Education project in particular, many civil organizations mentioned that it's very difficult for them to cooperate with the Ministry of Education, and also there are very few projects that they can carry out with the Ministry of Education. It's because there's very little overlapping in the areas between the civil organizations, projects, and the projects engaged by the Ministry of Education. And also, Ministry of Education focuses on teacher or the school of focus projects. So it's very difficult to find a connection with the Ministry of Education in terms of COICA projects. But one of the biggest difficulties that COICA is faced with is the administrative the procedures. So it's okay for us to proceed the on-site or the field projects, but we actually need to carry out a lot of paperwork or the administrative the procedures to implement our projects. This year and last year, I conducted research, actually surveying the staff members in the civil organizations, and actually most frequently answered the point was that they would like to have a streamlined administrative procedures for better the implementation of their cooperation projects. As I mentioned before, there is a great difficulty in terms of implementing or carrying out administrative procedures. It's very difficult to find relevant funding, and that's why a lot of the civil organizations try to find sponsors in the private business sector rather than going to the public organizations. And if you take a look at the 5-year plan for the Ministry of Education, there is a point which is, emphasizes the partnership with the civil society. So I believe that there is some improvement to be made in terms of ODA implementation, particularly the partnership between the government agencies and the civil societies. And also, when it comes to the partnership with the private businesses, I believe that such partnership is very important, particularly in terms of higher education project or the TVET project. The idealistic outcome of such project would be enable the students to get job in private business sector. So from the implementation stage, we need to engage the private businesses in the higher education projects or the TVET projects. I have had a chance to visit developing countries while conducting research in this specific area. And the biggest demand in the developing countries in terms of education ODA is the cooperation between academia and industry. And also, they wanted to learn from Korea, particularly in terms of boosting the partnership between academia and industry, and as a part of our support for developing countries, the Ministry of Education launched a higher education support program targeting developing countries. And I believe that the Ministry of Education needs to involve in the planning stage of higher education or TVET education support project and engage the private businesses in the design of a support program. And that should be the future direction for higher education cooperation project. Actually,
ESG 담당자들 많이 만나뵙거든요. ESG 담당자들께서 하시고 싶은 사업들이 많은데
I just happen to have a lot of discussions with the business sector people, particularly in the field of ESG. And actually, they have a lot of difficulties in identifying or discovering relevant new business models in the sector of the ESG. And they actually want to cooperate with the civil organizations. And also, we expect that there will be an increasing demand for humanitarian aid after the COVID-19 pandemic era.
하나씩만 질문 좀 드리고요. 짧게 답변해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
I have some questions, final questions for Mr. Park. In your presentation, you talked about the local and provincial education offices. Are there any projects that they can be effective partners in? So if you can just throw out some ideas. And to Ms. An, you carried out a lot of interviews. There are many challenges related to COVID, but I think there are a lot of opportunities as well. For myself, I can actually take part in 2 international conferences a day, so I have become more efficient. So there are many changes and challenges from COVID, but there are opportunities. So which opportunities do we really need to take advantage of at this point? And to Mr. Seo, this is the last question. I am actually engaged in ICT education for e-government. So we are providing this education to Asian public officials. I've always been curious when it comes to ICT in higher education. Sometimes it can yield unintended results. For instance, in higher education, for instance, if we give out diplomas, the students who receive the diplomas actually move abroad with that diploma. So what we were trying to do was we were fostering the higher education in that country, but it leads to basically all their talent leaving the country. So the problem is that the people who receive this education do not stay in their country, and sometimes they are not effective in communicating what they've learned to other generations in their country. So I would like to hear your thoughts about this problem, Mr. Park. You were talking about the cooperation with local and provincial educational offices. If you look at the projects so far, most of the focus has been on teacher exchange based on ICT projects. In the initial stages, we focused on delivering the programs that we have. But I think that now they have more capacity. They have a lot of resources at schools with teachers, and so they can be able to actually build a curriculum, and they will be able to collaborate with the schools in developing countries and co-develop a curriculum. So they can also exchange different classes, student exchanges, and they can exchange in many more sectors than they have done so far.
You just asked a question about where the COVID-19 and the crisis has turned into an opportunity. While you're working on the cooperation projects, we just came up with the sustainability issue, particularly the education cooperation project. While the project is engaged and carried out, and the actual sponsors take care of all the works. And once the project is complete, then the sponsor, the agencies or the staff members leave the target country or the partner country, and the project is not viable anymore in that partner country. That happened a lot. That's why we need to improve the capacity of the local experts or local staff members. Because the lack of local members or the local staff's capability lead to the failure of the past project. So in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we just came to realize the absolute need of the improvement of the staff members in the local fields. And I believe that actually there are a lot of efforts being made to increase the capacity of local staff members, and that is a quite positive signal, I guess.
In early 2000, the Lexus and the Olive Tree and The World is Flat were very popular books authored by Thomas Friedman. At the time, it was mentioned in this book about the issues related to brain drain. And I think that a lot of time has passed. And since we haven't been able to overcome these issues, I will not say which country, but there was one partner country, and we provided ICT capacity training for teachers of that country over a period of several years. After several years, when we went there to visit them, many of the teachers actually got new jobs in many countries around the world. The teacher salary is not that large. It's around 100,000 won in Korean won. And when they actually get a job at a bank, they can get paid double or triple of what they earn as teachers. And there's really nothing we can do on the field, but we need to be able to design the policies so that we can prevent this from happening. I think that this is something that we will continue to grapple with, as you mentioned, Professor. When it comes to ICT, sometimes it is a capacity that is generally very difficult to learn in the developing countries. And so there is a movement to better paying jobs or to other countries. I agree with you that this is an issue and a problem, but I really don't have the solution as to how we can solve that. I think that that is up to the domestic policies of the recipient country. They have to come up with policies to prevent this from happening. Thank you very much. ODA needs to be provided in the mid to long term with a strategy that is mid to long term as well. And I think the exchanges also need to have a mid to long term view so that we can think about many unpredictable events. And we also need to think about the sustainability of the cooperation as well. I would like to thank our presenters for sharing their experience and the outcomes of their results. I would like to thank our participants online. Thank you very much.